places at once. It'll work out. Good. Good morning, everyone. You're looking pretty bright. I hope we can stay that way. Good. So last night we talked about Rudolf Steiner's life and work and Jung's life and work. So we hope they're both here with us in some way. And my topic this morning is to give you, I guess I would say, two ideas. One is the evolution of consciousness. How did we get from way back to now? But the other one, the other part of it, in a certain sense, the more important part is, as a result of all that, what should we be doing now? What is our situation? Right? And if the story is accurate, and it has taken a really long time to get to be where we are the way we are, then we're probably not going to change it instantly or easily. In other words, there's a lot going on that we come into that we can't just create or dissolve. It's a big process with many parts, some of them very deep. And so it's not going to work out well to just ignore it. The best way would be to understand it and then proceed accordingly. So that's the two parts. What's happened? How did we get to where we are? And two, what is it like now? Okay? Now, one of the complicated parts of the topic is not just everything that's in this story that various people have told, but it seems like nobody has said as many details about it as Rudolf Steiner has. So the big question is, how did he get to know what he claims to know? And why should we pay attention to that? It seems kind of implausible. And although there are other people like, beginning with Hegel and Schelling, but then also Teilhard de Chardin and Sri Aurobindo and Jan Gebser, who have these big pictures and who are really good at explaining this process which landed us more or less where we are. No one gives so many details, and no one goes so far back to when they were to the beginning of planets, really to the beginning of the cosmos, and not with the Big Bang of recent science, but by his clairvoyance, by his seeing. And how does that work? And do we even think it's possible? Since not so many people have this ability, why would we think that he did? Well, I mean, we all have to make this decision. Each one of you and each one of us has to make the decision whether we want to pay attention to this. But it seems that while some people have a mystical ability, an ability to experience and sustain unity, all right, other people have this quite a different ability. It's somewhat mystical, but it's not just the experience of unity, which he does have, but it's an experience of the precise details of the past and certain aspects of the present. It's precise knowledge. So Steiner is an esoteric initiate. He's an initiate to get and transmit knowledge that the culture needs. What kind of knowledge? A knowledge of what's happened and what's the present situation, how should we be functioning together, and what's going wrong and how long is it going wrong and why is it going wrong, all the things that are going wrong. And I think you'll admit lots of things are going wrong, not just climate, but other things are going wrong too. Okay, so we have a person who seems from early on to have had the ability to look in, to see the interiors, to see patterns, to see processes, and even to see beings that are invisible. So if you were to read a book such as Outline of Esoteric Science, he talks about when there was, this is now the first big job, challenge, sort of struggle that we have, he says there was warmth. Now, there wasn't any objects, but there was warmth. And there weren't any objects, but there was light. So Steiner then talks about these formative powers that in traditional esoteric thinking are called hierarchies, these high beings above the angels, above the archangels, to powers and other levels, all right, that they poured them out their powers, their capacities to make the cosmos. So we grow up, I think, many of us, with the idea that, well, there's God and then there's the world. And Steiner always fills in many layers and levels and dimensions that are kind of skipped over by that simple view. There's God, no God. But he's saying, no, there's world, and then there's around the world, and there's around that, and then there's around that, and then there's this upper level, and an upper and an upper. So it's really good to try to get that picture that we're living in a completely enchanted universe. Remember, Sean was talking about disenchanted, which more or less happened beginning in the 17th century. And it became more and more disenchanted, so that the cosmos was not alive, not meaningful, and even if it were, we're separated from it, we being human beings. So thought is separated from matter. Descartes split the world in two. Res extensa, extended reality, substance, things, and mental reality. Res cogitans, I'm a thinking thing. Okay, so Steiner is trying to get us to live in a universe of significant beings, invisible, significant, pouring their powers into the cosmos. And we then are the last, the latest, I didn't mean to say last, the latest expression of the universe. All right, Thomas Berry is very good on this, talking about the human is the universe thinking itself in a new way. Right? The universe, and we are that instrument of the new way of the universe thinking itself. So human beings are the universe in its latest expression. All right. Steiner has the same view. So now he says that I want to get close to us, all right? Though reading about the old, really old-timey stuff is fascinating, but I want to bring it closer to our time. Let's think about the time that he calls the third cultural epoch. Sometimes he calls it post-Atlantean, and some people think that Atlantis idea is really great, and other people it's a big obstacle. Nobody talks about Atlantis except anthroposophists. It must be weird, etc. To give you a little hint, Steiner says that Atlantis, which was in a civilization or an island in the middle of the, off Europe, was extremely wet and damp. All right, everything was damp. It was sort of watery, and so it then sunk. And before it sunk, lots of sort of high teachers went to we could call the mainland, to Eurasia, to Europe, and particularly Asia, and became teachers. This is maybe 10,000 years ago. And there's hardly any physical evidence for this, so it's very hard. It's a hard topic. And we don't need it. All we need to know is whether Steiner is right in tracking not just different thoughts from time to time. Everybody agrees to that. What they thought then and what we think now are different. That's easy. But whether people thought differently, that the kinds of thoughts they had were appropriate for the way they thought, and they couldn't have had very different kinds of thoughts. In other words, in this third cultural epoch, he says, which is the Eurasian world that we know about, okay, that human beings were very close to spiritual beings. So when you read Homer and they're talking about gods and goddesses, you could say, well, this is something he imagined, which is what most people think. This is a really good literary work. It's like Hamlet or it's like Huck Finn. And Steiner said, no. Those people actually were the recipients of a constant influence of beings that did not depend for their existence on the people we're talking about. They had their own existence, like he says about angels. Angels are not just a dimension of our unconscious. They affect our unconscious, but they're real. All right, they have a real existence. So similarly, when we read in the myths of India or China or the Egypt and Greece, up to, he says, around the let's say 6th or 7th century BC, there was this kind of shamanic immediacy. There was much more easy and frequent that people were in touch, and they shared these deities and beings that were local and helpful and guided them. And Steiner says that these beings, sort of cosmic beings, gradually but appropriately transmitted this kind of knowledge, this kind of thinking to advanced human beings, who then guided other people, okay? And so the part that he really gets very thorough about is the next one, the fourth cultural epoch, which he says is around the 7th century BC up to the 15th century AD. So this includes what Karl Jaspers, Jaspers, calls the axial age, the age on which, in a certain sense, everything has been running, all right? And around the globe, this is wonderful to think about, around the globe there was a kind of explosion, particularly around the 6th century, 5th century. And in, let's see, where will we start? We'll start with the parts you probably know best, the Hebraic. This is the time of the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah. In the Greek, it was an explosion of Greek scientific, cosmological, philosophical genius. But Thales and Anaximander, Anaximenes, and Empedocles, and Pythagoras, and Parmenides, all these fabulous thinkers thinking entirely new thoughts about the cosmos and about human nature. Sean mentioned last night. Did you mention Empedocles last night? Heraclitus, another big one, yes. Tremendous explosion, the beginning of philosophy in the West, and anywhere, really. And then we go around, and Persia is the time of Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. And in India, it's an amazing time because it's the time of both the Bhagavad Gita and Buddha. Now, the text of the Bhagavad Gita that we have is much later, but apparently the revelation was around this same time, 6th century. And of course, the Buddha, which is one of the major transformative events in all of human history that rayed out all over Asia, starting in India, but then going to North Asia, into Tibet, and then to China, to Japan, and then through Southeast Asia as well. So really, that then becomes a vast transformative influence, surely equal, if not more powerful and more extensive than Christianity. Huge. That is that same time. And then in China, we have, which is one of the great continuous civilizations, right, in the entire world, a 5,000-year civilization with two major tracks. The most major one, obviously, being Confucius, which is this very same time, the teaching of Master Kung Fu. Tzu means teacher, so he was a master Kung Fu, and also the Lao Tzu, Master Lao, who gave us the Tao Te Ching with these gorgeous 81 verses, and Confucius is the social organizer, and Lao Tzu is the mystical aesthetic teacher, which encourages a kind of grace and rhythmic life, and Confucius is kind of more ritual and organized and can get into a little rigidity sometimes, and when that happens, then the Taoists kind of have their say, and they break apart the Confucian, and then the Buddhist in China follows the Taoist line. It has a little, the Buddhist and the Taoist kind of taking turns in this dialectic with Confucianism. It's quite a dramatic, exciting story, but it all comes from this same time, this axial period, 6th, 5th century around the world. And they didn't influence each other. Afterwards, maybe 4 or 5 centuries later, there were some travelers, some people brought things back from the Middle East or from India to Greece, particularly by the time of Plotinus. There's lots and lots of Indian thinking in someone like Plotinus in the 3rd century AD. But so these, if you look at it's, if you did some kind of a globe with the bright lights for where an axial breakthrough is happening, you'd see it's global and it's very, very intense, and it continues. So the only thing that's not included in this little thing I've done is Christianity, which comes from Hebraic and Greek with a new element, right? But it's those two elements. Christianity really stands on 2 feet, the Greek and Roman. The organizational part was Roman, but the thought was Greek, and the Hebraic, all right, and that with a new element of the incarnation. And the only other piece that is missing, of course, is Islam, which people might think of as Asian, but it's clearly Western, and it's built up out of the Judaic and Christian elements and the whole Arab mentality and a tribal configuration, which is made up of many of these same elements that, if we would get in there and really pay attention, we would find out it's not so strange as we thought. That's a whole big story. Okay, so now that is what I wanted to say about this 4th time, this 4th culture, which is not just new ideas, but a new way of thinking. Now, how do you summarize the new way? The new way is that it's much more human-generated. So these people are in touch with deep sources, but they themselves are doing the thoughts. They are formulating their ideas in terms of their experience. It's not just listening. It's giving much more personality to these deep sources and deep ideas. So now we attach names to these people, Confucius and Buddha and Pythagoras, and they have followers, and they have personalities, and the language makes a big difference. So there's a much more, and we're getting now a real storyline with some personality and some very, very distinct elements, so that it's not just a transmission, but it's some kind of a dialogue, which is, of course, the key word that you want for understanding the Hebrews. The Hebrews were in dialogue with Yahweh, right? And Yahweh would talk to them, and they would do something and could try to bounce back, and they might not pay attention. Then the prophet would come down from the hills, and this toothless, bearded guy would come down and scold everybody. And then they say, okay, we'll do better, we'll do better. So there's a loop going on there. And so in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, as it turns out, Arjuna, who's on the firing line, turns to this charioteer. He's a great charioteer. And then he gets this revelation. But Arjuna is the one who had to get depressed in the first place to have received this revelation. He had to be in a position to need an answer. He argues back. This is a stupid war. I'm not going to fight this war. And Krishna said, well, let's look at it. Let's look at it. And then he teaches the yogas, and pretty soon, 90 pages later, well, no, 45 pages later, chapter 9, Arjuna says, wow, that's different from what I thought. That's okay. All right. I'm getting it. So there's much more of a loop now in this time that goes, then we're going to do in a minute, the Christianity. These are the axes, the wheels on which these cultures proceed. Okay. Now I'll turn to the part, a big, you could say 3 big, but I could say 1 big, interventions in human history. I'll do a minute on Krishna, and then Buddha, and then Christ. These are the beginning of the axial time is Krishna, about whom Steiner gives 14 lectures, Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita. So he really did a lot of learning about this. He had to have read some books and talked to some people, as well as having his own clairvoyant, esoteric experience of this Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita. So he really went into the yogas that are in the Gita, the knowledge, the action, the love, the meditation, the 4 yogas. Some people say 3, but sort of 4. And who was Krishna? And he says Krishna was the beginning of a new I consciousness, an I consciousness where Krishna has this tremendous sense of selfhood, of his being kind of in charge of peoples, of a culture. And he says in chapter 4, verse 7, when you make a mess, which is what you've just done with this stupid civil war, and you don't really know what you're doing, when you've made a mess like this, and then we can see how many times, World War I being the most obvious kind of mess that humans make, when it had no meaning at all. Nobody can figure out how it started or why it started. Well, here was another one of these messes, and Krishna says, when you people, you can just see him being a little impatient, right? Oh, very impatient. When you make a mess, that I have to come from these 3 worlds that I occupy, where I was perfectly content, and I didn't need anything, but then I saw you sort of really a bunch of jerks. And so I come, and I have to straighten you out and teach you what to do next, which is then the beginning of a new consciousness that should run along the rails of these yogas: spiritual knowledge, spiritual action, spiritual love, meditation, and paying attention to the idea that history is really part of a divine plan, and you should pay attention to it and not try to make up your own plan. So it's not quite the view of the modern West. It's the beginning of something new, but it still has a very strong conservative element. This war is while in a certain sense it makes no sense, in another sense it's part of the mechanism of history. All right? And he says, so when Arjuna says, everybody's going to get killed, and Krishna says, don't worry about it, they're already dead. So that's the conservative element, that you're not going to change that. The question is, how do you deal with what's going to happen? All right? So the war came because you didn't know what you were doing, but now that you have it, you have to adjust your mentality and deal with this in terms of your discipline. How do you get order and structure in a way that is selfless and, Krishna says, is me-minded, is divine influenced. And then you'll know that you're doing the right thing. Even if it's a war, at least the important thing is not whether it's a war. The important thing is whether you are you're related to a larger universe, historical processes. All right. Now, to some extent, Buddha comes out of that world. I mean, he's, after all, Northeast Indian. He's in a certain sense, there was no Hinduism. That's a new name. But he grew up with all of these yogic teachings. And he was a prince, and he was privileged. He had a beautiful wife and a beautiful son, and he had a nice house with pheasants and good food and a lot of silk, and he had it made. And then, but he was protected, and he went into the town against the orders of his father, who was trying to keep him at home. But that doesn't work. Any parents, it doesn't work. They are going to go, and if you get them ready for that, they'll do better than if you try to prevent it. So he goes into town with his teacher, and he sees the 3 sorrows: the people who are sick, and the people who are old, and then he sees the young men carrying a casket, as you can see in Asia, down to the Ghat, to the riverside, for the body to be burned. And these 3 sorrows, see, now we're talking karma. How did it happen? These sorrows are overwhelming for him, whereas lots of people are seeing these every day, not caring about it. It wasn't just that he'd been protected. It's that he had this enormous soul to experience these 3 modes of suffering. And then he turns to his teacher, and he says, teacher, who are they? And there's a line of monks, as you can see, in Asia, right, with these orange outfits and their hats and their meditative walking. And he says they're monks. And they're trying to solve the problems that you just saw of suffering, of sickness, old age, and death. He then, of course, goes off into the forest to meditate for 7 years, and he keeps complaining he's not getting anywhere, and neither is anybody else. He says, we're learning to meditate, but we're not solving the problem of suffering. And then he has this amazing breakthrough, as he says, under the Bo tree, under the tree of enlightenment, he finally gets to the point where he has this absolute middle way, that it's not a matter of embracing suffering or ignoring suffering, but transforming suffering by selflessness, by non-attachment, by giving up me and my in favor of a kind of co-arising, codependency, co-everything. Everything is mutual and beautifully woven. And he says this false idea that I am an isolated self is like a strand in a sweater. It just totally misses what the reality. The reality is mutuality and not independence. So that's a beautiful teaching, a great spiritual insight about a little bit like what Sean was talking about, unus mundus, that it's all one world of parts, and none of them are really separable. But from the point of view of some developments that were already underway in the West, emphasizing some amount of individuality and discrete human personalities, this was not perfect. So the discipline was great, but there was a kind of a regret that it didn't have some of the individuality that was already emerging. Okay. So, and then Steiner says the major transformative event in human history, not that required Krishna's contribution, required Buddha's contribution. He even says that in the spiritual world they collaborated, these great beings, which is kind of really different from these religions who are beating each other up and competing. He says these great beings all collaborated and collaborate in the spiritual world. And then he says there was this event which he calls the mystery of Golgotha. It's the incarnation, incarnate into flesh of a divine being. I think when you read him on Buddha, that same phrase holds, that Buddha was a very vast, and is, I think, a vast spiritual being who comes into the life of Gautama. Buddhists don't usually talk that way, but it's not so far different from what they say, and they themselves don't agree. And in the case of Krishna, it's a divine being, but it's not so clear whether he incarnated, whether he actually put himself in that chariot body. In the case of Christ, Steiner says Christ is the being that is one with the ground of being, one with what is called the Father, the source of creation, through which, he uses then the Gospel of John, the early prologue chapter. In the beginning was the Word. This word is English word for the Greek word logos, right, which is the name of Christ. So in the beginning was the Christ, and the logos was, and then it says both, was with God and was God. It's not clear how to translate that. Sometimes it says a God, but certainly it was a divine being, and nothing came into being that did not come through the logos. So now there's a joining of the divine being with with creation in a way that involves not a being that's still in the spiritual world, but a being that has come into a human body. So this is really very dramatic to have the joining of a divine being and history on the ground with a real body, with with a mother and teachers and walking on the hills and getting blisters from sandals and then eventually being executed and reappearing in that part of the world to those followers. A very dramatic story by any account. And Steiner says this is now the beginning of a huge, the largest, most deep transformation yet in the human story, because it joins the spiritual and the physical in a new way, and in a way that is attentive to history, to peoples, to sin, salvation, to kind of cultic thinking, and the breaking of cultic thinking into a more universal way of thinking. So Jesus Christ talks with sinners, with strangers, with people who are not part of that cult or that people, and breaks all kinds of barriers in an attempt to create a more universal world. All right. He then says that this being continues to bring about transformation to the extent possible by this loop again with human beings, and so this has to be institutionalized, and to some extent, in Steiner's view, what might have happened, what should have happened, didn't quite happen, and he says that Christianity really, in a sense, hasn't yet happened. That it has had a history, but it's still, it doesn't have it is not so evident as a complete mission of love as it needed to be, and so that's the great struggle that's going on. The struggle for the full incarnation of the, not just the teaching of love, not just the example of love, which he says Buddha did wonderfully, the teaching of love and the example of love, but now he's talking about a kind of transformative power of love, the presence of love. So he regards the incarnation of Christ as a force in the world, which of course is opposed. So that's the struggle, is to get, last night I was talking about Christ as the balance between the physical, which is affirmed but not exclusively, and the spiritual, which is affirmed but not exclusively, and how do we join a real spirituality in our physical lives, in our life that has to do with sex and money and power and knowledge and and storms and all kinds of important things. All right, so where are we now? He says, if you look at the beginning of the mission of Jesus Christ, now, because he says Christ entered into Jesus at the baptism for the last 3 years of his life, all right? And the baptism is this initiation when the initiation means a higher capacity. Well, his higher capacity was the joining of Christ to this Jewish man named Jesus of Nazareth, and the next deed, the next event, as soon as that joining took place, was he encounters the opposition, and there's a temptation, right? And Satan tempts him, says, "I'll give you all of this. Right? All you have to do is to acknowledge me." And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." But they're now going to go toe-to-toe for the next 3 years. And so the next experience, he sees a woman who is possessed, and he drives the demons out of that person. He says, and the demons go into pigs. All right, I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But what did they do? Okay, so this actually is not a lot of justice. But there are dramatic stories that we need to ponder, that these beings are all around and trying to take possession and going, "Psst, there's nothing but matter." Basically, nothing but money, sex, and power. Get with the story. And the Christ talking about universal love and transformation and depth and knowing the I and the I relation to the Christ. And this is the higher self, which Sean and I will surely talk about in the course of the morning, because both Steiner and Jung have this idea of a higher, deeper self that is related to something bigger, to a larger self, a universal self. Okay, so where are we now? We are in a historical period in which the revelations, the big revelations have been made. They're still being made, maybe not so big as Krishna or Buddha or Christ, but other people who are interpreting them, who are big, Dalai Lama, Sri Aurobindo, Rudolf Steiner, Teilhard de Chardin, etc. The whole increase in human rights and the whole feminist revolution, all of these are major positive advances, and at the same time, we are destroying the earth, and we're basically still killing each other, and there are 2 million sex slaves throughout the world, and what is that about? And so it's clearly this incarnation has not really done its work, or hasn't gotten us our cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. So what he's trying to say is, wake up, this is not a peaceful situation. It's not the peaceable kingdom. There are tempters who are brilliant and powerful and are in charge of, let's say, technology. They're in charge of money. They're in charge of sex. They're also in charge of farms. They're in charge of Monsanto. And that's happening every day. And we are going to lose our living qualities, the relationship between the earth and the body. And so this is a battle. It's a kind of a civil war that's going on all the time between these beings who are not entirely evil. They are the motors of wake-up, improvements, and change. But as Sean was talking about last night, that the opposition is necessary for love. So we have to enter into, deal with, and vanquish these beings and their aides, right? Nazis and torturers and rapists and people who are cruel. We have to encounter them. We can't hide from them, and we have to bring about the transformation, right, which would bring a universe of love. But you don't do that by sleeping. You have to do it by entering into the world. So Steiner says, and this I'll end here because we want time for questions. Steiner says, did this right? I did this right. Yes. Okay. I can't think about time when I'm talking. I have it written in front of me. Okay, so I'm going till 9:30. No, but then there's okay, so I have more time. Okay. Good. I have another 15 minutes. Okay, reset your body or whatever it is that you're listening with. Okay. I know this. When I start lecturing, I should look at a clock and say, when it gets there, all right, I'm finished. All right, but there isn't a clock, so I have to keep looking at this little watch. If I were building a room, there'd be a clock. Okay, here we are. Reset. So the present situation is, and this is kind of a hard part with Steiner and anthroposophy, is a battle. Not everybody likes that. In other words, you really would rather have a gentle, sort of soothing teacher. Sort of everybody loves everybody, just send each other cards. You can even now do electronically, it only takes a second. And we can just do nice. And Steiner is saying that the deep spiritual forces, the Christ forces, can't take over by themselves. They need participation. He talks about the Archangel Michael, who is the champion of individuality and freedom, and doesn't interfere, but does present a kind of a model or a lure, an invitation to human beings to come to another kind of consciousness. And he says this is a big change beginning in the 20th century when the 1879, when this archangel, who is the sort of the champion of the evolution of individuals and humanity, not of groups, but of individuals, then starts a new kind of reign. And that was, he was also, he or it, I don't know about this he stuff, but this archangel was the great guiding figure for the evolution of Greek thought, early sections of the Hebraic thought, when there's an awakening of consciousness. So now the task is to see the battle in front of us as absolutely real. It's not mirage, illusory, oh well, this is sort of not quite, not really happening. It is happening, and real terrible suffering and loss of opportunity and what should happen. And at the same time, it's not only that, it's much higher or deeper than that. It's at the level of the archetypes that Sean will talk about in relation to Jung, or at the level of angels and archangels and hierarchy that Steiner's talking about. It's at the level of these high beings, Krishna and Buddha and Christ, and he also talks about other beings like Zarathustra and Moses, and then of course the whole Sophianic dimension, the squashing of the feminine for at least 2 centuries, probably 2 millennia, probably 3, maybe 3.5. The great book by Baring and Cashford talks about the beginning of the replacement of the Sophianic, the divine feminine wisdom goddess tradition, takes place in Baghdad in Iraq around 1200 BC. It's an extraordinary story. And then after that, we get sky gods who are male and pretty violent and vengeful and kind of immature, and loss of the divine quality of the human and the earth and the generative processes and nature and seasons, and all of that now is at issue. So Steiner says we haven't lost Christ. We still have access to Christ, but we have lost Sophia. We have lost Isis. Sophia, because Isis was the feminine for 3,000 years in the Mediterranean world, and then in a way that you can regret if you have a pagan view, but you can celebrate if you're sympathetic to Christianity. That Sophianic dimension is replaced, largely replaced, and also with some violence involved, by the goddess dimension of the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. And when that is too squashed, as it still was in the early medieval period, then what happens? The archetype, right, which Jung knows so much about, the archetype arises, and then throughout Europe, there are 1,000 cathedrals and churches built in every large town and city, all named Notre Dame, Our Lady. And then there's this tremendous cult of the Virgin. And Steiner says this is the necessary rebalancing of the spiritual dimension, which has a certain violence to it. It is a battle, after all. But the violence can be distorted and used against people and against the innocent and etc. when it needs to be transformed and used against the tempters who are trying to get us to believe there's nothing but matter, nothing but sex, money, nothing but power, etc. So this Sophianic dimension, which is extremely important to Steiner. Those of you who see Steiner's kind of very male, and he is, you don't see too many pictures of Steiner smiling. He's pretty serious, he always wears black, and he's always worrying about the world, which is sort of almost literally going to hell. And you might say, well, where's this, how about a little feminine, a little too much yang, not enough yin? And if you read him on Sophia, the divine feminine, if you read him on, say, like the fifth gospel, where he depicts his clairvoyant intuition of Jesus in his 20s talking to his mother about his mission and suffering and what has to happen, and it's profoundly moving. You'll see there that this is not some kind of a samurai spirituality. It's a spirituality that involves suffering, sacrifice, and a tremendous example and celebration of love coming out of struggle. So the tempters are real, but they don't have to win. We can meet them and arise from this struggle, celebrating love, which according to Steiner, and I think according to Jung and some other great thinkers, is not possible without struggle, without pain, suffering, opposition, up against. It's out of the dialectic, out of the struggle, that we arise to the level of individual and cosmic love. And if you look at the life of Jesus Christ, you will find that it has that capacity, that the love, the resurrection, comes out of the crucifixion. That is the archetype. In the case of Steiner, the great love of humanity comes out of his attempt to introduce a deeper way of seeing, of thinking, of feeling, out of his own suffering, his own opposition, the opponents, the adversaries, as they're sometimes called, who were somehow behind the burning of the Goetheanum, somehow involved in getting the followers to do nothing but argue with each other, somehow involved in people being lethargic when they needed to rise to the occasion, and somehow involved with, there's an amazing story that I just heard from this wonderful doctor, Peter Selg, beautiful lectures talking about how Steiner would tell his physician and very close collaborator, Ita Wegman, an amazing person, about this remedy and that when he was losing his strength. And he said, I no sooner take the right remedy when the adversaries turn them to toxic. So in a certain sense, he was assassinated by these beings. And Sri Aurobindo and the mother had similar struggles for survival and for health and etc. I don't know that side of Jung, but he certainly had struggles in going into the unconscious during the 4 years that Sean was talking about. I would call him Jung, that would be good. Sean was talking about when he goes in and tries to discover his own myth, and it's not just embarrassing, it's painful, and it's great struggle and loss, and is he going insane, and etc. These are the necessary challenges that we have to take on in order to go to the next level, which means probably dealing with the child in our class who drives us nuts, and dealing with a hard marriage, or dealing with not enough time, not enough money. But we're trying to do something important. These are our daily lot. We don't all have to do crucifixion, but we have to have some amount of grinding, sort of sandpaper, salt, something that we have to rub in our life, or that rubs us. That from which we then emerge at another level of generosity and love. So that's what I think Steiner is saying about the evolution of consciousness, about Krishna, about Buddha, about Christ, about our present situation, about the tempters, and about where we're going, which is nobody knows. He doesn't say. It's a real battle. The winners are not announced. So there's a lot at stake. And we'll talk more about that in the course of the morning. So that's the lecture. And I now have left a half hour for questions and comments and confusions. Okay. Whoever put the water in the tissues here, thank you very much. I usually say, I don't care about that, but I do. Okay. Oh, thank you, Sean. Two questions. And the windows are open. No, I guess we already have enough, huh? Okay, I'm the only woman, I guess. Okay, 1, 2, 3. No, we can't have 3 men in a row. 1, 2, 4. Who's 3? A female voice. Thank you. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Go ahead.
My question was about population, taking into account of population on our planet today, and how does that take into account the conflict that we have between the choices we make?
Well,
that can have a drastic
There are too many people for the resources. We know that. There really are too many people for the resources. And so there will be there's already suffering. There's going to be a lot more suffering because this many people can't get access. I mean, theoretically, it might be possible, but practically, this many people are not going to be able to get the food and water that they need, especially with desertification. So there are people in various parts of the world who are walking 5 miles for water. So it is a case of human beings not being able to solve their own problems. And it could take a long time. And it could happen that the population will be controlled by death, by premature death. I don't know. There are very powerful sources like forces like the Catholic Church that is against any kind of population control. But it does seem like a completely wrong idea. Which isn't to say that there shouldn't be struggles and pain and suffering. It is to say that one group of affluent people should not be forcing suffering on a non-affluent people. I like the line of Nicholas Bajayev, who says, bread for myself is a physical matter, but bread for my brothers and sisters is a spiritual matter. And so all of us who are affluent, and we all are here in this room, you might not feel it, but you are relative to the rest of the world, have excess of everything, and particularly food and water, and literally at the expense of other people. So this is a huge problem. And so are anthroposophists involved in this? Well, there are. I mean, I've heard lectures and read essays and things by some people from the executive committee and other, like the agriculture section of the School of Spiritual Science, who are very deeply involved in resources, food, water, and the whole ecological catastrophe that we're involved with. And I think that there are really good anthroposophical scientists who are also spiritually minded, who are deeply involved in this. I don't have that kind of an answer, but it is a human-created problem, and it's not being solved quickly. Yeah, if you know anything about the work of the UN, you know that the opposition to the solutions, and affluent countries give food that doesn't get to the people, and that's why I said it's not that it can't be done, but it's not going to be done because the corruption is really widespread. Very hard problem. It's a good question, really good question. It's one of the wake-up things. People don't know that there's not enough food or asleep. Yeah, everybody should know this. Not enough food, not enough water for the people who need it. And the people who need it are poor and powerless and not very often in Western Europe and North America. They're in other places. Good. That's a really good question. And yes, please?
I recall from previous talks that you've given that you mentioned both Steiner and Jung state that the West's path is not through the East, i.e. Buddhism. I was wondering if you could comment more on that.
I could. The question is, this gentleman has heard me say something about, quotes Jung saying that in an essay called Yoga in the West, that yoga is not intended for the West, and that the West will develop its own yoga along the lines laid down by Christianity. Personally, and it'll be interesting to hear what Sean says, and maybe I'll turn to you right now instead of waiting, that I think that in general, negative statements are not usually completely accurate. That is to say, the ones that say, this is not going to work, very often it's an incomplete statement, not taking account of the way in which some solution for another time and place has probably evolved in such a way that yoga, not everybody's doing the yoga of Patanjali, which is a that axial time, 6th century, and that the people who are doing it now and teaching it now are contemporary people, of course, and the language and what the language means is different now. And so it doesn't seem to me to be a completely true statement. On the other hand, I agree with Jung that there is something profound and almost irreducible about the Christian commitment to incarnation, the divine permeating human history and human communities and the human individual, which you don't find in the yoga tradition. You do find it in Sri Aurobindo, who is a Western-educated scholar of Indian thought, and he transforms yoga, and he creates something called Purana Yoga, which is the integral yoga, which involves evolutional consciousness and the intervention of the divine. So it's a very complex and intriguing question. And of course, in the West, we also have yogas that have nothing to do with Christianity. But Jung, being a depth dimension thinker, thinks that all of our disciplines should involve access to myths, symbols, the unconscious. So in other words, it wouldn't be just enough to do the kind of yoga that lots of people here do, which basically hatha yoga, yoga for, you know, being cool and slim. That's only one of the limbs of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So I don't even know what Jung had in mind when he said yoga. Did he know about the 8 steps of Patanjali? Did he know about different kinds of yogas? I mean, in a certain sense, the Bhagavad Gita doesn't even mention those yogas. It's about knowledge, action, love, devotion. I don't think he was meaning that. So it's not a helpful phrase, and yet it's also an indication. It tells us a lot about Jung's contention that spiritual disciplines should have a depth dimension. And Christianity is one way to get that.
And Steiner's is something similar, I recall?
Steiner too. But in his lectures on the Bhagavad Gita, he does treat the yogas very positively. But even though he takes us right up to the great revelation in the middle of the Bhagavad Gita, which is an incarnation, no, I shouldn't say that. It is a revelation, maybe an incarnation, but certainly a revelation of the divine to humanity. It's clear that he has in mind that another step, 2 more steps are coming. The Buddha is yet to come, Christ is yet to come, and this is a necessary stage. So he's very positive about the yogas, but it's still, for him, somewhat preparatory. But it's not negative as the Jung statement. And Jung was, I mean, these great figures are fighting so many battles at once. It's like running president. I mean, you know, if you say one thing, you get beat up over here, etc. And so it's an okay essay. I think we could write a better one. Okay, Sean, do you want to add to that?
Not much. I mean, you said everything I was thinking. Just one little point, maybe. So Jung was writing at a time, and he was writing largely for Europeans and a few Americans. And since, if you imagine what's happened since the 1930s, 40s to now, there's the whole phenomenon of globalization. So there's a sense now that, well, first of all, there's so much more mobility. But even for people who haven't experienced great mobility in their individual lives, physical mobility, those of us in the so-called developed countries, at least, increasingly live in an informational, sort of subtle environment that is permeated by the whole planet. And you know, through the internet, through Google, and so on, the world's traditions and cultural symbols and memes and values are instantly available in a way that they weren't back then. So you know, that's changed, and it's changed us, and I think it's made Western people, whoever that is, and it's getting harder and harder to define, but people from the developed, so-called developed world, see, you know, the late industrial usually northern, western countries, are increasingly feel themselves as part of the world, even if they don't acknowledge it consciously. So for them to take up an Eastern discipline, I think, is a different matter than it would have been for a European in the 1930s or 40s. It would have been a much bigger step for somebody back then. And I think as a physician, as a psychologist, what Jung is worried about is, the analogy is that if I had problems with my parents, I didn't. Well, and of course we all had problems, but let's say I had traumatic issues with my parents, and I turn 17 and I meet some friends, and I really like their parents and I want them to adopt me, and I want to change my name and so on. That's fine, or is it, sort of thing. So Jung would say, well, okay, if you want new parents, that's fine, but you need to make peace with your old parents somehow, and not necessarily literally if they've abused you, but you need to make at least peace internally with your family of origin. Like, we know that psychotherapeutically. To move on, we need to integrate the past and not dissociate it. It doesn't mean to completely forgive necessarily, but we need to integrate in some way the past. So if you're searching for a spiritual path, Jung would say, your past, you need to take your past into consideration because it lives on in you in the depths of your psyche, whether or not you're conscious of it. And for him, again, he was speaking to people who back then, their cultural unconscious was Christian. And the access to spirit, the divine, had been mediated for the previous almost 2,000 years by these Christian symbols. So for somebody to just say, oh, I'm going to go now use these symbols, it would be like, suddenly changing your medication, to use another analogy. If you've been eating something for a certain diet for all your life, and you decide, oh, I'm going to change my diet to this because I like it. Well, that may be all right, but there could be serious consequences as well.
That's great. The other point is that for us, the Buddhist teachers and yoga teachers are mostly from our own culture. It's hugely different. So the Patanjali or the Dhammapada, some text is, for us, is already filtered by our own Western 21st century consciousness. So in a certain sense, it's such a remove from the sources that it's hard to say something about it in the same sentence. That's a really good question. And there was
Irene.
No, you were third.
Yeah, and
Who
she
was
is
second?
number 3.
Are we up to the third?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay.
Irene.
My question is, as you brought almost in parallel that battlefield of the Mahabharata,
Yeah.
etc., and the today battlefield.
Yes.
Would you see the same path to overcome that battlefield in the time of Krishna and Arjuna, the victorious of the Tenebrae, and today?
That's good. Yeah. So bring up to the question. So this text is 90 pages, and it starts out the guy on the battlefield who's the head warrior of his half of the Civil War, and it was the just side actually, turns to Krishna and says, "There's a horrible war," and Krishna then leads him into the battle, and says 5 times, "Therefore go and fight." All right, this is a little troublesome. And so what does that mean? Well, let me give you 2 interpretations, and then you can choose. Gandhi says it couldn't mean that the God leads this man into battle and says, go and fight, and don't worry about the women and the children and the whatevers. The war has to take place, go and fight, and just be conscious of me. Gandhi said it couldn't mean that. And Sri Aurobindo, another very great Indian teacher, very different from Gandhi. Gandhi's doing action yoga. Sri Aurobindo is doing a whole synthesis of yogas at a very high, sophisticated level. He says, no, that is what it meant. That's what the text means. That's what the God intended. And at that time, that was the right thing to do. It was an unjust war. That is to say, the one side was wrong. The other side should have killed them. Okay. Then you turn to the Second World War, And why is Gandhi saying what he's doing? He's saying, we've just had this horrible First World War. Now there's a Second World War, and we should not participate in this war. All killing leads to more killing. Can't you get the message? And Aurobindo says, don't you see, a la Jung, a la Steiner, there are high beings behind this surge running through Europe and oppressing people and violating freedom, killing, torturing, and millions of people will die, and it will take millions of people to stop this violation of human evolution. Hugely different. Therefore, he says, India should join with the British, should join with the Allies and fight the war, and Gandhi says, war will lead to more war. There's no reason to get into this war. Hugely different. Now, what does Steiner think? Steiner actually doesn't have much to say about it, except that he says we have to recognize what's on the ground, and we have to recognize what is deep, and we have to figure it out. So we are in a situation now where we really need Gandhi because we have governments declaring war on other peoples and killing people very, very unnecessarily. All right, so we really need more Gandhi. On the other hand, we need a little bit of Aurobindo's sense that it's possible. Remember, Sean was saying this last night. It's possible that something really negative could bring about a better positive. That takes a lot of wisdom, and that's where we are. It takes a lot of wisdom to know when these little wars are bringing us to a better situation or not. Very hard, very hard. We do know, I think, pretty clearly that selfish, fear-driven people who start a war, right, in recent memory, that's almost certainly not advancing the evolution of consciousness. But it's also possible that, I'm not settling this for you, it's possible that some opposition to violence could bring about a situation which couldn't come about another way. Possible. That's what we don't know for sure. Yes, please. I can tell already you're going to need to speak louder for me.
Okay.
I don't hear well.
All right. I'm wondering what Mr. Steiner might have had to say about either or a set of purposes for life or for the planet, maybe in a fateful sense. So I'm wondering if it was about the struggle and the process of evolution and growth, and or once Unus Mundus realized and practiced what the purpose or potential or abilities of that kind of planetary...
I missed a word. What kind of planetary?
What kind of potential?
What kind of potential for the Earth?
For the Earth, yes. For sort of this collective growth realized and practiced.
Okay, well, fasten your seatbelt. He thinks that on the very far distant future, the ideal would be, or is, the ideal is that human beings, which is the latest expression of the universe and the divine, will so love the Earth that the Earth will be spiritualized in this beautiful relationship between human and Earth, as a result of which then the further evolved humans will transmit to another planet. But that is very far away. And if it should happen, I mean, I have heard prominent anthroposophists say that this ecology thing is, whatever, don't worry about it because Steiner says, we're going to leave the Earth anyway. Right? No. Steiner says that our task is to so love the material world. See, this is the thing about Christ. Christ came into a body. And the task of humanity is to so love and transform the physical world that it becomes spiritualized. Then it's okay to leave to another task, by which time we may be better at our task, who knows, but there'll also be negative forces. So do not draft him into this idea that it's okay to burn the Earth. If the Earth burns by selfishness, that is not love, that is selfishness. So the stakes are very, very high for him, even though it's a long-term process. Right? Okay. Yes? 1, 2. Thank you, Sean.
Actually, this question connects with what you were just talking about. I'm really curious. You mentioned the idea of these huge souls of both Buddha coming into the body of Gautama and Christ into Jesus, and I know you're making a distinction between those two, but they're similar too. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the distinctions.
Yeah. In Steiner's view, the distinction is that, first of all, both are necessary. Buddha had to happen. It's absolutely crucial. Now, whether he would add for that half of the world, I don't know, but that's the way I think of it. Right? That half of the world needed an incarnation at the level of Buddha. Okay? I'll say about the present situation in a minute. And the Christ had to happen for this part of the world, which, for one thing, was deteriorating. I mean, Rome was not from the point of view of law, was an enlightened culture, but from the point of view of spirituality, was not. I mean, they really did not have a high spiritual consciousness. All right? And there was lots of darkness and cynicism in that culture. And there really was a rescue mission needed, because it was a tremendously male, power-oriented culture. And also, the whole Jewish history had been preparing for this, I mean, profoundly. Okay. So now, from Steiner's point of view, what is the relationship? Steiner says that Christ and Buddha are related in the spiritual world, working on behalf of humanity. All right. He even says, this is one of those things that makes you just sort of gulp. He even says that in the 17th century, that Buddha performed a sacrificial deed on the sphere, the psychic sphere. I don't know if you're thinking that way. The soul of Mars. So that when souls pass through that sphere, sort of astrologically, on the way to Earth, they would get some amount of compassion in addition to the Mars quality that's there unbearably as Westerners became more and more violent. And I don't know if we became more violent. We certainly, but there's a certain kind of violence that came in. I just read a biography of Alexander. I mean, Alexander just killed people. Just took over towns and his soldiers raped and slaughtered. Just, you know, and you read about the unification of China. They beheaded 25,000 people in a day, and the whole river ran red. So, I mean, but there is another kind of horror that happened in the 20th century. Emil Fackenheim calls it absolute evil, where people are determined to kill each other, even at their own expense. So he says that battle for the minds and hearts of human beings is going on, and Buddha is important, Christ is important, but so are amazing numbers of other people, you know, who don't have those two, but have other people. I mean, the whole Asian world has grandparents, you know, has Kuan Yin and all kinds of good things. So that's going on. Steiner himself is a Western person, so he knows more by personal experience, but also culture. He knows more about Christ and Archangel Michael and etc. And he doesn't say that they're the same beings as over there. Sometimes they look alike, sometimes they're really different beings. And it sounds like some beings have responsibility for some groups of people and not for others. So there could be a being for an institution. Might be a little being. Could be an angel for you know, a Waldorf school or a city. Now, I don't know if St. Francis is doing anything for us, but maybe.
Because it sounds from the times I've heard you talk that there's something about Christ that is more this union with the physical.
Yeah.
That's different.
Yes, I should have mentioned that. For one thing, there's if Steiner's right, there's tremendously complex preparation to receive this Christ being. The parts that went into the making of Jesus of Nazareth, that included parts from Krishna and Buddha, all right? And this exquisitely prepared human being with this exquisitely prepared mother, this amazing mother who then is the host, but also the producer of this amazing physical being. And then there's this tremendous suffering, physical suffering, and the bleeding into the earth, And so from Steiner's point of view, this is a huge marriage of heaven and earth, or heaven and the human. But then, in addition to that, he says, in the 20th century, and I can't help but think it has something to do with the ecological situation, in the 20th century, the etheric, the life principle of Christ will surround the earth. That's huge. If it's true, it's huge. It doesn't mean that we don't have a problem and we can't burn the earth. It means that we have access to some guiding principle. I mean, Thomas Berry writes these tremendously depressing books about, biocide, the killing of all, the possible killing of all life in the near future. I don't know if it's so near, but it certainly is a really bad sort of direction. And then at the end, he says, we must assume that guidance is available. So, I don't know, but Steiner says, yeah, there is guidance available, and it's very close at hand. It's the whole etheric realm. The living part of our person is part of the living part of the Christ that surrounds the earth. If that's true, that's huge. We could spend some time thinking about that. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Yes, please.
So this kind of relates to...
Coming down because I don't hear well.
Is it? I don't think it's on. Is it on?
I don't, how about if you stood up?
Okay.
You willing to do that? Great.
I'm willing to stand up. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to put this into words. It's more of the going off the concept of love of the earth. And I think you were talking about this, ecological crisis that we're in. And I think in terms of human beings evolving, my thoughts have been that, and I think Steiner may have spoken of this, but I wanted to see if you could elaborate. If we evolve to the point where not everyone evolves at the same level, right?
Right.
Okay, so you've got some people who are embracing love and the love of the earth. There's this concept that he's put forward that we're going to evolve and go into a next state of being. And I'm thinking that, and the earth is no longer going to exist, but human beings, maybe not all of human beings, are going to go to that next stage, which he talks about. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because it doesn't seem to me that I think that you have to love the earth and try to protect the earth, but it doesn't seem to hinge on whether or not the earth survives.
You have to love the earth, but whether or not the earth is going to survive?
Yeah, because the earth is eventually going to evolve and it's not going to be here.
Right.
And I think our job is to evolve to the point where we are experiencing love. And that's the job of humanity, and to try to strive to protect the earth. But it doesn't mean we have to be successful at doing that.
Yeah, nothing is... See, you asked me to elaborate, and my first response is I don't want to, because I don't really know very much about this. I'm not able to think the thought about something that's tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of years away, not only because I don't have that kind of imagination, not only because I doubt that it's so clear that Steiner could actually see what will happen. He could only see what might happen. And even more fundamentally, maybe even dogmatically, I have a strong conviction that there are no future facts. It's not determined. And therefore, I think we should read these parts of Steiner as a way of saying to ourselves, Steiner sees a pattern, and by a certain imaginative extrapolation, he sees where it could go, and I find that helpful because he's so brilliant and so pure and so etc. But I don't want to put any money on it. And I don't want to think in terms that have me buy into a future fact. For me, if it's future, it's not a fact. It's open. Bad things can happen. We can burn the earth. We have the capacity to destroy all life on earth 40 times over. If the wrong person got to that button, there would not only be no life, there would be no future life. We have that capacity. So therefore, to talk about something in such an almost unimaginable future is something that I don't spend time with. I spend a lot of time thinking about what are we doing and what are our motives for doing. And I'm very nervous about anthroposophists who think that when Steiner says something is going to happen, that it's fixed. And therefore, well, we can just sort of sit it out. It's going to happen anyway. This is what I call retrospective karma, where I'm surrounded by people who say, including the guy, the recent senator, if a person is raped, then God wanted that. Okay, we're all breathless. Okay, this is retrospective karma. Whatever happens was intended. This, I think, is a pernicious worldview. It's really destructive. And I think Steiner can be used that way, and I think he lent himself to this kind of unfortunate interpretation because he sometimes talks about the future with a confidence that I can't handle. And that's just a personal opinion. You have to hear somebody else's lecture on the same topic and get a different opinion. But I just can't handle it. I think these fabulous people see patterns. And the future does have a lore capacity. We are pulled in the future way. And there are beings who can see what can and might happen. But I don't want to say that it will. And if he does, or when he does, I kind of turn the page. But that's just me. We have to break. Thank you.